So let's get to the improvability argument. So there are different ways to sort of construe this kind of argument. Here's just one way. So I guess the first premise would be something like, if God exists, then it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world. That seems pretty plausible. Like, the world could be improved in certain ways. Like, he could have created more happy people, or like our pleasure could have been like adjusted 10% up. So it was like every instance of pleasure was like a 10% increase without affecting anything else. Or, maybe certain instances of evil could have been prevented and the world would have been slightly better. Or maybe God could have just made a different causally isolated universe. If you think our universe is on the whole good, which theists are apt to think, then maybe God could have just created a separate causally isolated universe, which is exactly like ours, which, is on the whole good. The common thought here is that God could have created like more happy people, and that would have been a good thing, and the world would have been at least slightly better if God had done that. So if God exists, then it seems possible for God to create a better world than the actual world. If you disagree with this, you're going to think that the actual world, if God exists, then it's not possible for God to create a better world than the actual world. So the actual world is either the best possible world or like tied for the best possible world. So like the world couldn't be improved in any way whatsoever, like to make a better world. And that doesn't seem particularly plausible. And most theists haven't want to go that route. Okay, so that premise seems kind of plausible. The next premise is that, well, if it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world, well, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. And you might think that this is just intuitively plausible. Think of a kind of artist analogy, right? Like, pick Van Gogh or something. Van Gogh made various artworks. It seems like Van Gogh would have been a greater artist if he had made even better art, right? We'd rate him more highly. He'd be a better artist, it seems. He'd be a greater artist. Similarly, you're a greater inventor if you make a better invention. And so, by analogy, it seems that also like you'd be a greater creator if you make a better creation. So then it would follow that if it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. Just like if it's possible for Van Gogh to create better artwork than he did in the actual world, it's possible for him to be a better artist than he actually is. Moreover, if God were to create a better world, it seems like in that world, he'd be responding to and acting on better reasons, right? Because reasons more strongly favor creating a better world than creating a lesser world. And so then, it seems like in the world where he creates a better world compared to the actual world, yeah, like I said, he seems to be responding to and acting on better reasons, and that seems to reflect better on him as an agent. Maybe he'd also be more praiseworthy or something like that, but regardless, there does seem to be at least some intuitive motivation here for thinking that if it's possible for God to create a better world than the actual world, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. So from those two premises, it's going to follow that if God exists, it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. But alas, if God is perfect, then if God exists, then God is a perfect being, right? And it's not possible, arguably, it's not possible for a perfect being to be better in any respect than it actually is. This is just what perfection is. Like, if you could be improved upon, you're not perfect, you're not maximally perfect. And so then, since if God exists, then God would be perfect, and it's not possible for a perfect being to be better in any respect, it follows that if God exists, then it's actually not possible for God to be better in any respect than he actually is. And notice what we've just delivered. Earlier I argued that if God exists, then it's possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is. But we also just concluded that if God exists, then that's not possible. And so then it follows that God doesn't exist. To see how that follows, suppose we have the following two things, like if P, then Q, and also if P, then not Q. How can we infer the negation of P from that? Well, suppose that P were true. By our two premises, we could derive both Q and not Q, right? So we'd be able to derive a contradiction.
Yep.
And if you make an assumption and you derive a contradiction from that assumption, it follows that your assumption is false, right? So P would have to be false. And so similarly, God doesn't exist from this sort of argument. I'm for the audience, I'm not here to say that this argument is a definitive proof that it succeeds. I just think it's interesting and it spawns really cool thoughts. And that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. There's lots to think about there, of course. The idea, I guess the first idea to unpack is this idea that God could always improve upon the world. I think this is kind of plausible. Like there's difficulty in trying to imagine a sort of maximally great world, because like even just by like creating another planet Earth, like somewhere outside, maybe like a multiverse, you just add like another universe, Although maybe a multiverse that's genuinely infinite would sort of be filled up. I don't know. It gets a bit weird. But it seems like you can always just create another Earth. You can always just like double the amount of people and make sure that they're all like happy. And that seems like a good thing. So it does seem plausible to me that there can always be improvements made. The next thing to say is that God would always choose to do that. I mean, you could say, given that it's impossible to have a maximally great world, God sort of has morally good reason to just arbitrarily pick a sort of state of goodness and just be like, this is what I'm running with. But that does seem a bit arbitrary. It does seem a bit weird. But if it's a choice between doing that and not creating a world at all, seems like maybe he would prefer that. But like, okay, that I guess that's the like. I'm not gonna contest the first assumption that the world could be made better. What I'm going to contest is that God could have done that, and also that by doing so, he would be a, quote, better God. You gave the example of Van Gogh, or rather Van Gogh, and how if he created better paintings, he'd be a better painter. This probably has something to do with the standards by which we're judging, let's just call him Vincent, by which we're judging him, right? God doesn't seem to be, in most religious traditions, judged by like some kind of like epistemic survey or some like empirical survey of the things that he creates. God is not as good as the earth he makes. God is this maximally great, perfect being that sort of exists out in the ether or whatever, and like creates the world, and could create it worse, could create it better, can sort of do what he wants. But like his goodness would exist even if he never created anything. If he just sort of existed in all of his glory, he would still be perfectly good in a way that Van Gogh, if he created no paintings, arguably he could have still been like a really good painter if it just so happened that he magically had this ability to paint without practice. But like, we want to say if Van Gogh didn't paint any paintings, he wouldn't be a great painter. If God didn't create any universes, people would probably say he's still a maximally great being, which means that this assumption that to create a better world would make you a better God probably breaks down.
So I think that's where the debate is going to lie. I think that's or like, yeah, not as in like knowingly tell a falsehood, but like that's where the debate's going to be. I think this is probably where, yeah, theists should reject the premise. I mean, it is hard to deny that there's some kind of intuitive plausibility behind the premise, and ultimately that's what we're relying on when we mount arguments for and against God's existence. We're just ultimately, we can't mount arguments and premises ad infinitum, right? So we'd have to stop at some kind of premise eventually, and what do you say on behalf of it other than no, it just seems really plausible. So I think that maybe they don't find it plausible, but like it's hard to deny that there's some sort of plausibility behind it. I don't know. I mean, maybe they'll construe goodness as kind of like dispositional. So like Van Gogh or whatever it is, Van Gogh, how good he is as a painter. Maybe that's like more so kind of like intrinsic dispositional thing, and it can manifest in various ways. But like, had it manifested in a better painting than it did in the actual world, doesn't necessarily mean that he's a better painter, just because that's a matter of his sort of like intrinsic capabilities and his kind of dispositions, right? It just maybe sometimes they manifest in a better painting, and sometimes they manifest in a slightly worse painting. But the goodness of the painter is a function solely of, the capacities to like, concoct in your mind a beautiful scene, and then, the capacity.
Yeah, maybe a better example here is like being a good singer. That might help sort of understand this a bit better. I mean, more conceivably, you could just naturally be a really, really good singer, but you never sing. You literally just never sing in your entire life. You never sing a song, but you're still a really good singer in a way that someone who's a worse singer than you might make better music, might put things out into the world, but they're still like a worse singer, because being a good singer isn't dependent on what you put out. It's dependent on what you like could put out if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's like your intrinsic capacities. Yeah. So like then the thought would be that, well, then likewise, it's not possible for God to be better in some respect than he actually is, because like his goodness is a matter of sort of like his intrinsic character and his intrinsic capacities as well. So that's one way that you could go. I mean, does this address though? So that addresses one kind of motivation for the premise. I mean, one might still contest it. One might find it still intuitively plausible that Van Gogh would have been a better painter. I mean, like, arguably we all have like the intrinsic capacity to develop ourselves in various ways to, be really, really good at painting if we spend so much time at it and so on. But like, that doesn't make me as good of a painter as Van Gogh or something. So anyway, there are ways that one could push back on that. But like, there is another kind of line of motivation for that premise, which was that, when God is creating a better world, it seems like, like the reasons to create a better world seem to, they seem to be better reasons than the reasons to create a worse world. Like you have more reason to create a better world compared to a worse world. It seems like, I don't know, that seems really plausible. Just like if you're making a painting, you have more reason to make a better painting than you do to make a worse painting. So then, if that's the case, well, then it seems like in the world in which God creates, in the world in which that world is better and God creates it compared to this world, it's better than the actual world. It seems like in that world, God is responding to and acting on better reasons than he does in the actual world. And doesn't that seem to reflect better on him as an agent? He's acting on better reasons than he does in the actual world. So maybe that line of reasoning for the premise doesn't succumb to the same sort of objection. Again, it's maybe. I'm putting this forward for people as food for thought.
Yeah, I think it's interesting at any rate. I do like these considerations of God and possible worlds and all of this kind of stuff. Like, I've thought about this before in terms of the problem of evil. Like, why isn't there less suffering? And there's kind of an argument that can be said like, well, the world could always be morally improved. There could always be more pleasure and more good and all this kind of stuff. So in order for any universe to exist at all, God has to sort of arbitrarily pick. And so to make the complaint that the world could be better actually is undermined by the fact that that's always the case. And so it doesn't matter what universe you find yourself in, you could be making some kind of problem of evil case as to like why the world isn't better. And so it's sort of like this kind of consideration I think can cut both ways depending on the context in which it comes up. But as an argument for atheism, I think it's interesting. I mean, interesting is, I suppose, one of the measurements by which we might rank this, but also its power, its convincingness, its convincingness, if that's a word. What do you think, Joe? Where does this sort of sit for you in terms of its actual power?
Right. Well, I mean, it's certainly not knocked down. It's going to be very hard to find knockdown arguments for or against God's existence. It's not like atrociously bad. I mean, it's not like the stone paradox.
I like that bloody stone.
So I'm thinking somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, we've got sort of universe big, and we've got evil God. Universe big is in D tier, evil God is in C tier. So compared to those arguments,
it's close to both of them. I'd say it's close to. I'd say it's closer to the evil God challenge. So maybe C tier. Maybe that's where I'm leaning.
Sort of, because let me think about this.
It's a fascinating argument. It brings up lots of interesting topics about what determines the greatness of a being. Each of the premises has a degree of plausibility. Like it's not like it can't be supported, and it's not like each premise is like ludicrous.
I think I'm not convinced on this. Like, a better created universe would mean a better God. It's like, if the universe had an extra planet in it with more people being happy, God is like a better being by his nature, which I think kind of is necessary, or is like is a requirement of this argument. It's sort of, I don't know, there could be like a myriad of different reasons why like the universe is as it is and not an improved version of it, which I mean, we probably don't even have time to begin exploring how many there are. I mean, maybe there aren't as many as I imagine, but like it just makes me think that there's got to be a bunch of like theodicies, so to speak, that would apply here that kind of make me want to knock it down to D tier to put it along with like universe being big. Because like the universe big thing, like as I said myself before, I kind of think that's kind of powerful. Like it does something emotively to me, but like as a syllogism, I'm not really sure. But similarly here, I'm getting a similar vibe. It's like, yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's some kind of consideration in there, but it's not enough for me to like I wouldn't use it in a debate, right? I wouldn't bring it up as one of my arguments. However, I might bring up the evil God challenge. I might say that at a podium, at a formal debate, but I'm probably not going to bring up this argument because I just don't think it like does it,
I think that's fair. Right. I would say either C or D. So if you want to put it in D, that's fine.
I would I would say probably D, and also it's
Okay.
my show, so my no, not really. But if you really are sort of somewhere in between, I'd be happy with like a
let's
sort of
put it. Let's put it
C
D.
0.5.
C minus. No,
C
let's put it in D.
C minus.
Because you're leaning towards
Look at
D.
me, see,
So
that's why you're the academic one, Joe, because you realise that C 0.5 is a ludicrous thing to even say out loud. Okay, look, we'll put it in D, but bear in mind also, there's room to maneuver here. We could knock the God Rock down and the Universe Big down. I mean, we could put Universe Big in E and then God Rock in F if we wanted to, but whatever. We'll sort of have it hovering around. We'll put it in D tier for now because it needs to go somewhere on the screen. Improvability is what you call it, isn't it?